What if the architects of America's greatest scientific achievements, rockets, spaceflight, missile systems, were the same men who once built weapons for Adolf Hitler? This isn't a metaphor, it's history. And it began under a covert post-war program known as Operation Paperclip. As Nazi Germany collapsed in 1945, Allied forces closed in from all directions. American, British, and Soviet troops stormed into a devastated country, searching not just for remnants of the Third Reich, but for something far more valuable: intellectual capital. Plans, prototypes, scientists. Germany, for all its atrocities, had produced one of the most technically advanced war machines the world had ever seen. Jet aircraft, guided missiles, nerve agents, radar systems, and experimental medicine had all been developed under the Nazi regime, often with horrifying human cost. And the men who designed them were suddenly without a nation, but not without value. The Allies faced a choice: treat these scientists as war criminals, or treat them as assets. The United States chose the latter. The program that would become Operation Paperclip was launched under the auspices of the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, a secretive American intelligence group formed during the war's final stages. Its mission was clear: locate and extract as many German scientists, engineers, and technicians as possible before the Soviets could reach them. The stakes were enormous. A new global order was emerging, and the battle for technological superiority would define it. Whoever secured these mines would gain a decisive advantage, not just militarily, but ideologically. At first, the project was known as Operation Overcast. It was a logistical operation to bring in a handful of German specialists to work on American soil. But the scale and secrecy soon grew. When concerns arose over the moral optics of hiring Nazis, the name was quietly changed. Paperclip referred to the paperclips attached to doctored personnel files, redacting SS affiliations, political activities, and potential war crimes. The sanitized versions were submitted to government agencies and military recruiters. In other words, it was a bureaucratic erasure. A war criminal on one page became a government employee on the next. Leading the effort was Colonel Bosquet-Wev, director of the JIOA, and his deputy, Samuel Klaus. The momentum was clear. As one internal memo put it, the U.S. must not be outdone by the Soviets in securing the services of German specialists. Among the first and most famous recruits was Wernher von Braun. A member of the SS and the technical mastermind behind the V-2 rocket, von Braun had overseen the production of a weapon that terrorized London and Antwerp. Thousands of civilians were killed by V-2 strikes. But the weapon's development had an even darker legacy. At the Mittelwerk underground facility where the rockets were manufactured, over 20,000 slave laborers from the Dora-Mittelbau concentration camp perished under brutal conditions: starvation, beatings, executions, disease. Von Braun knew this. He visited the tunnels. He signed off on production schedules. He remained silent. Despite this, he was extracted by U.S. military personnel and brought to Fort Bliss, Texas, along with over 100 members of his technical team. There, they began working under Army supervision, continuing the very rocketry research they had pursued in Peenemünde, only now under a different flag. The American government would later describe him as indispensable. By the 1960s, von Braun was not only a leading figure at NASA, but a household name, featured in Walt Disney specials and Life magazine spreads. His Nazi past, though well documented, was rarely discussed. But Paperclip was not built on one man. Take Arthur Rudolph. He was the operations director at Mittelwerk and deeply involved in the logistics of the underground factory. Survivors of the camp later testified that Rudolph personally oversaw punishments and forced labor quotas. In the U.S., he became a project director for NASA's Saturn V program, the rocket that would carry Americans to the moon. He was awarded the NASA Distinguished Service Medal. Only in the 1980s did investigations catch up with him. Under threat of prosecution, he renounced his citizenship, and quietly left for Germany. Another was Hubertus Strughold, often referred to in American circles as the father of space medicine. In Germany, he had overseen aviation medical experiments, including high-altitude and freezing experiments conducted on prisoners at Dachau. In America, he led the U.S. Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine and contributed to the safety protocols for human spaceflight. The Strughold Award, once given annually by the Space Medicine Association, bore his name until it was quietly retired after renewed scrutiny in the early 2000s. The list grows longer. Walter Dornberger, head of Nazi Germany's military rocket program, went on to work for Bell Aircraft in the United States and contributed to the development of the X-15 rocket plane. Kurt Debus, a former SS officer and close associate of von Braun, became the first director of NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Hans Lindenberg, who worked on advanced radar systems for the Luftwaffe, later helped the U.S. Navy develop its electronic warfare capabilities. By 1955, over 760 scientists had been officially relocated under Paperclip. Many were placed in strategic research centers, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Fort Detrick, Los Alamos, and numerous military labs. They became embedded in the machinery of American defense, training younger generations of American engineers, designing new weapon systems, and pushing the frontier of American science. Some were placed in academia. Others disappeared into the classified world of military R&D. The rationale was always the same. If we don't take them, the Soviets will. This was not a paranoid fantasy. The Soviet Union ran its own parallel program, forcibly relocating thousands of German specialists to secret cities deep inside Russia. They too knew that the war for the future would be won not with boots on the ground, but with data, designs, and disciplines. In many ways, Paperclip was a preemptive strike in the Cold War of intellects. Yet from the beginning, Operation Paperclip was steeped in contradiction. Publicly, the United States was preparing war crimes trials in Nuremberg, prosecuting Nazi officials for crimes against humanity. At the same time, in quiet military installations, it was employing their colleagues, sometimes the very men who shared lunch tables with the accused. This wasn't just cognitive dissonance, it was a state policy. In Washington, efforts were made to keep the operation out of the press. When questions arose in Congress, officials assured lawmakers that no serious offenders were being brought over. Internal memos told a different story. Paperclip wasn't a loophole. It was a machine of erasure, efficient, deliberate, and deeply bipartisan. Pause. Behind every name added to Operation Paperclip was a calculation. What does this person know? What can they build? And can we afford to let that knowledge fall into Soviet hands? The answers almost always leaned toward justification. Take Walter Schreiber, a medical general in the Wehrmacht who had testified against Nazi doctors at Nuremberg. Despite his role in Germany's wartime medical system, he was moved to the U.S. in 1951 and employed at the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine in Texas. Only after press reports and public backlash did he flee to Argentina. But his case was not unique. It was just one of the few to leak into public view. To understand why so many of these men were protected, even celebrated, we must look at the geopolitical reality of the late 1940s. The Soviet Union had exploded its first atomic bomb. China had fallen to communism. Eastern Europe was behind the Iron Curtain. In Washington, fear hardened into doctrine. The Cold War was not a temporary standoff, but a permanent condition. And in this new kind of war, scientists were soldiers. In the early 1950s, the U.S. began forming what President Eisenhower would later call the military-industrial complex. It was a vast ecosystem: corporations, research labs, defense contractors, intelligence agencies, all feeding off Cold War funding. Paperclip scientists were woven into this structure not as outsiders, but as core contributors. They wrote classified papers. They briefed generals. They helped draft blueprints for a new American century. Some even consulted on projects that never saw the light of day, like Project Horizon, a 1959 plan by the U.S. Army to establish a nuclear-armed base on the moon. Or Project A119, which explored detonating a nuclear bomb on the lunar surface as a show of force. These sound like science fiction, but they were real proposals, with Paperclip veterans among the consultants. Others worked on more tangible programs: the Redstone missile, the X-15 rocket plane, the early Mercury and Gemini space missions. Their fingerprints are all over the aerospace achievements of the 1950s and 60s, but they also contributed to darker endeavors. At Fort Detrick, Maryland, some German scientists participated in the U.S. biological weapons program. They advised on pathogens like anthrax, botulism, and plague, many of which had been studied in Nazi laboratories using human subjects. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Paperclip recruits joined early programs in high-speed flight, extreme environmental testing, and radar countermeasures. In time, their research would evolve into some of the most advanced black projects of the Cold War. Yet for all the secrecy, the truth began to leak. In 1963, journalist Drew Pearson publicly exposed that Arthur Rudolph and other Paperclip figures had Nazi backgrounds. The government dismissed the reports. It would take another 2 decades before documents were pried from the Pentagon under Freedom of Information Act requests. When they finally emerged, they painted a damning picture. U.S. intelligence had knowingly imported war criminals, falsified records, and shielded them from accountability. But long before those revelations, there were warning signs. In 1949, the U.S. Department of Justice began investigating Paperclip for potential violations of immigration law. Most of the scientists had been brought in under temporary military visas. Their Nazi affiliations made them ineligible for permanent residency under existing statutes. Instead of halting the program, the government quietly altered the rules. Special waivers were issued. Background checks were curtailed. By 1955, hundreds had received citizenship. Their pasts had not been forgotten. They had been erased. One of the few internal critics was Samuel Klaus, a State Department legal advisor who objected to the falsification of records. He wrote that many of the recruits were ardent Nazis and that their arrival in the U.S. would be a grave mistake. But Klaus was sidelined. His objections were deemed unhelpful. And so, the machine rolled on. Culturally, Paperclip was a paradox. The same country that celebrated victory at Nuremberg was parading former Nazis before television cameras. In 1955, Wernher von Braun appeared on Disney's television program Man in Space, enthusiastically explaining how rockets could carry humans beyond Earth's orbit. The American public was charmed. They never heard about Mittelwerk or the prisoners who had died under his supervision. The narrative had been rewritten, and America believed it. Even in textbooks, the contributions of Paperclip scientists were decontextualized. Students learned about NASA's triumphs, the Apollo moon landing, the X-planes, but rarely the origins of the technology or the men behind it. Historical whitewashing became a form of national amnesia. By the 1970s, cracks began to show. The anti-war movement, the revelations of MK-Ultra, and the post-Watergate push for government transparency triggered a wave of declassifications. Researchers began asking new questions. Who were these scientists? Where had they come from? And what had we sacrificed to obtain their knowledge? Holocaust survivors and Jewish advocacy groups led efforts to investigate the pasts of these men. In 1984, Arthur Rudolph was denaturalized. In 1993, Hubertus Strughold's name was removed from an annual award. But these were exceptions. Most Paperclip scientists lived out their lives in comfort, respect, and obscurity. Their names appear in patents, memorials, and aerospace literature. Their crimes are footnotes, if mentioned at all. Pause. To understand the full scope of Operation Paperclip's influence, we have to move beyond rocketry and spaceflight. Because the program didn't just bring over engineers, it imported an entire philosophy, one where scientific expertise was detached from ethical responsibility. That mindset would echo across generations of classified research. By the mid-1950s, Paperclip scientists had fanned out across military and civilian sectors. Many were embedded in projects so secret they remained off the books for decades. Their knowledge was applied to ballistic missile guidance systems, early computing, radar jamming, and hypersonic flight. But others, particularly those with backgrounds in medicine, psychiatry, and human physiology, were pulled into murkier territories. This included early research into psychological warfare. The Central Intelligence Agency, newly formed and aggressive in its Cold War posture, took a special interest in interrogation, brainwashing, and the limits of human endurance. Their efforts would culminate in MK-Ultra, a top-secret program that experimented with drugs, sensory deprivation, electroshock, and behavior modification, often on unwitting subjects. While Operation Paperclip and MK-Ultra were separate initiatives, they shared a common lineage, the belief that the pursuit of superior knowledge justified moral compromise. Several Paperclip recruits were consulted on projects related to human limits, high-altitude survival, and neurological response under stress. Their wartime experience, particularly the brutal experiments conducted in Nazi camps, was repurposed under the guise of national security. Consider the case of Dr. Siegfried Ruff, who was indicted at the Nuremberg doctors' trial for overseeing aviation experiments on prisoners. Though acquitted, his research would later be cited by U.S. defense medical teams studying high-altitude ejection and oxygen deprivation. Or Dr. Hermann Becker-Freising, another Luftwaffe physician, whose findings on starvation and seawater ingestion, conducted on camp inmates, were quietly reviewed by Navy researchers studying survival at sea. To be clear, these individuals were not always officially part of Paperclip, but the lines were porous. The U.S. intelligence community was willing to source data from wherever it originated, regardless of how it was obtained. Nazi documents, concentration camp logs, and SS medical archives were copied, translated, and filed. The information was deemed too valuable to ignore. The Cold War, after all, was not just a political standoff, it was a scientific arms race, and in that race, ethics were a distant consideration. This moral flexibility extended into space policy. Von Braun and his team, now deeply entrenched in NASA, played a pivotal role in designing the launch systems that would take America into orbit. The Redstone, Jupiter, and Saturn rockets all bore their influence. But as America reached for the stars, it did so on the shoulders of men who had once built machines for a genocidal regime. And yet, these men were not haunted. They received medals. They cut ribbons at space centers. Von Braun was even awarded the National Medal of Science. In 1977, shortly before his death, he gave interviews reflecting on his career. He spoke of technical challenges, of dreams realized. Rarely did he mention the war or the factory tunnels beneath the Harz Mountains, where thousands of forced laborers had died so his rockets could fly. The media, for the most part, played along. Through the 1960s and 70s, newspaper profiles of Paperclip veterans emphasized brilliance, not background. The story of America's space conquest became a myth of ingenuity, courage, and unity. The darker chapters were edited out, deemed irrelevant, or worse, inconvenient. To question the legacy of von Braun or Debus or Dornberger was to risk undermining the very story America told itself about victory. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, the Soviets ran their own version of Paperclip, Operation Osoaviakim. On October 22, 1946, Soviet forces rounded up more than 2,000 German specialists and their families and transported them to the USSR by night. These included physicists, chemists, and engineers. Like the Americans, the Soviets weren't concerned with ideology. They were interested in results. German scientists contributed to the development of the R-1 missile, a Soviet copy of the V-2. Others assisted in jet propulsion, metallurgy, and radar systems. But the Soviet program was harsher. The scientists were often held in remote compounds, isolated from Russian researchers. They were paid, but heavily monitored. Few were allowed to return to Germany until the 1950s. In contrast, Paperclip scientists in the US were given homes, salaries, and in many cases, citizenship. They integrated into their communities, taught at universities, and shaped entire academic disciplines. Some even advised on US educational policy, helping to draft STEM initiatives during the space race. This comparative leniency raises deeper questions. Why was America so eager not only to use these scientists, but to protect and elevate them? The answer lies in the broader ideological battle. The U.S. saw itself as the leader of the free world. To admit that it had employed and celebrated men linked to the Holocaust was to admit hypocrisy. So the truth was buried beneath bureaucratic language, sealed records, and national pride. Only in the post-Vietnam era did the tide begin to turn. A new generation of scholars, journalists, and activists began to dig. In the 1980s, Linda Hunt, an Associated Press journalist, used FOIA requests to uncover hundreds of documents related to Operation Paperclip. Her book, Secret Agenda, published in 1985, confirmed what many had long suspected. The U.S. had knowingly imported Nazi war criminals and falsified their records to do so. Her revelations sparked outrage in some corners, but also silence. By that point, the scientists were old or dead. Their achievements had been canonized, and for many Americans, the details of their pasts seemed distant, even irrelevant. The moon landings had happened. The Cold War had been won. The price, it seemed, was worth it. But history doesn't work that way. Pause. By the late 1980s, Operation Paperclip was no longer a secret, but it was still a controversy. Congressional hearings were proposed, though few materialized. The Department of Justice, under its Office of Special Investigations, OSI, quietly began reviewing the citizenship status of known Nazi affiliates. In a few rare cases, like Arthur Rudolph, denaturalization proceedings moved forward. But for the most part, the program's legacy was handled not with prosecution, but with quiet distance. One reason for this was institutional inertia. The military branches, NASA, and various defense contractors had spent decades building their capabilities with the help of paperclip recruits. Many of these agencies were reluctant to revisit the origins of their success. To do so would require an accounting not just of individuals, but of an entire national strategy. It would also reveal just how intertwined Paperclip was with the development of America's post-war identity. The Apollo missions, the Minuteman missile, the X-planes, the medical protocols for high-G training and spaceflight, none of these existed in a vacuum. They were the result of research teams, facilities, and theories that could be traced directly back to German laboratories. Some of those labs had been located in concentration camps. The uncomfortable truth was this: American scientific exceptionalism, in part, had a foreign and fascist lineage. And that truth was not just academic. Survivors of Nazi atrocities, many of whom had emigrated to the U.S. after the war, sometimes lived in the same cities as the men who had once served their persecutors. In Huntsville, Alabama, home to von Braun's rocket team, Jewish communities were not informed of the pasts of their new neighbors. In some cases, local leaders even celebrated these scientists with parades and dedications. It wasn't until the 1990s that formal acknowledgments began to surface. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum opened in Washington, D.C. in 1993 and included exhibits referencing Paperclip. Academic conferences were held. Declassified files were published. But public awareness remained limited. The wider cultural reckoning didn't arrive until the 2000s, when filmmakers, investigative journalists, and independent historians brought renewed attention to Paperclip's legacy. Documentaries like The Good Nazi and The Scientists Under Hitler began appearing. Books like Erich Lichtblau's The Nazis Next Door detailed how former SS officers had lived quietly in American suburbs, working as engineers and researchers. Still, even in these works, one question remained elusive. How should we judge their contributions? It is one thing to acknowledge that these men had pasts. It is another to evaluate what they built in the decades that followed. If a man was complicit in wartime crimes but later helped win the space race or deter nuclear war, how should history remember him? This moral ambiguity has no easy resolution. It is the central paradox of Operation Paperclip. For the intelligence community, however, the lesson was clear. Moral compromise can be operationalized. Paperclip became a blueprint, not just for acquiring knowledge, but for managing the consequences. That model would resurface in later Cold War programs, from the CIA's use of ex-Nazi spies in Operation Bloodstone, to its recruitment of authoritarian defectors, to its protection of war criminals in Southeast Asia and Latin America in exchange for intelligence cooperation. It also shaped America's approach to secrecy itself. The Paperclip files were among the first major post-war records to be classified not for tactical reasons, but for reputational ones. They were hidden to protect the image of American righteousness. That decision would set a precedent used repeatedly in decades to follow, from Project MK Ultra to COINTELPRO to the Phoenix program in Vietnam. The Paperclip mindset, that truth can be suppressed in the name of strategic advantage, became part of the architecture of U.S. intelligence. And it was not limited to the Cold War. In the modern era, echoes of Paperclip can be found in partnerships with foreign scientists, research exchanges with countries under authoritarian rule, and the hiring of private contractors with opaque pasts. Today's innovations in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and surveillance draw on global talent pools. In some cases, those pools include individuals who once worked for regimes engaged in repression or abuse. The ethical calculus hasn't changed. Only the technology has. Meanwhile, descendants of Paperclip scientists live and work in the U.S. today. Some are engineers, professors, or researchers. Others had no idea of their ancestry until declassified documents were brought to light. In certain families, the truth was never discussed. In others, it was quietly accepted as the price of survival in a post-war world. For survivors of Nazi atrocities and their descendants, Paperclip remains a scar, not just for what was done, but for what was denied. The fact that perpetrators were not just spared, but elevated, given homes, medals, and television shows, was a betrayal that could not be undone. Yet for many Americans, Paperclip is still unknown. It is rarely taught in schools. It is absent from most space race retrospectives. Museums and memorials that honor NASA often sidestep the origins of its leadership. The statues remain. The citations go uncorrected. We do not diminish achievement by examining its cost. We do not dishonor progress by exploring its roots. But we do risk losing our moral compass if we refuse to ask how much we were willing to forget in order to get ahead. Operation Paperclip ended officially in the 1970s. But Operation Paperclip is not just a chapter of history. It's a lens, revealing how easily truth can be buried beneath power and how progress is often built on silence. We didn't just inherit the science. We inherited the secrecy. Paperclip's legacy is literal. Facilities that house today's weapons and space research were shaped by former Nazi engineers. They laid the foundations for modern launch pads, jet propulsion labs, and missile systems. It wasn't just about what they built, but how. Their methods, classified research, Compartmentalized teams and minimal oversight became standard across American institutions. These patterns flowed into corporations, think tanks, and universities. The influence of Paperclip is still felt in DARPA contracts, civilian aerospace startups, and global research initiatives. The language has changed: innovation, security, but the mindset remains: push boundaries, justify later. The program also shaped our national memory. Narratives of World War II victory and space race triumph often exclude the darker truths, the silent deals, the edited histories. For decades, Hollywood projected a clean image: white lab coats, heroic engineers. But that myth is fading. Documentaries and journalism now ask, who were these men, and why did we protect them? The Cold War answer was always the same: their knowledge was essential. But each decision to prioritize utility over ethics created a template for future compromise. Paperclip is not just history, it's a mirror. It shows how nations justify betrayal in the name of progress and how the victors reshape the truth. We teach about the moon landing, but we must also teach about Mittelwerk and the 20,000 forced laborers who died producing V-2 rockets. This isn't about shame. It's about acknowledging that progress has a price, and that forgetting that price erases part of our humanity. We've done it before. We said it was necessary. But we know more now. We've seen how secrecy metastasizes, how truth bends, and how narratives harden. That's why remembering Operation Paperclip matters. It showed us that scientific progress without ethics breeds distortion, that national security without accountability becomes a mask. These men shaped history. They built the rockets that reached space. But they also brought with them the ghosts of a regime that prized brilliance over humanity. We must not forget. And we must keep asking, what do we owe the truth, especially when it's uncomfortable? Operation Paperclip is not fiction. It comes from declassified files, FOIA requests, and testimony. It happened, and it shaped the world we live in. Welcome to the Forbidden Index.